Imagine being a teenager and inheriting a whole kingdom for yourself. Well, that wasn't just imagination for Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great inherited a nation and then decided that wasn't enough. Over the next 13 years, he would conquer an empire stretching from Greece to India, defeat armies that outnumbered him, found dozens of cities, become a pharaoh, and create one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And somehow he did all of it before the age of 33. This is the story of how one teenager ruled half the world. Alexander was born in 356 BC in the Kingdom of Macedon, a powerful state located just north of Greece. His father was King Philip II, one of the greatest military leaders of his time. His mother, Olympias, was known for being fiercely ambitious and more than a little intimidating. Some ancient stories even claim she told Alexander that he was destined for greatness from birth. Whether that was true or not, one thing is certain. Alexander grew up believing he was meant for something extraordinary. Unlike most princes, Alexander was not raised in luxury alone. He was trained to fight, ride horses, command troops, and study philosophy. And speaking of philosophy, his tutor was not some random teacher. It was Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. One of the most famous thinkers in human history, spent years educating the future conqueror of the known world. But Alexander was not only interested in books. One of the most famous stories from his childhood involved a horse named Bucephalus. The horse was considered completely uncontrollable. Adult trainers could not ride it. Soldiers could not calm it down. Then a young Alexander noticed something. The horse was not wild. It was scared of its own shadow. So Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, climbed onto its back, and rode it successfully. According to legend, his father watched the entire thing and said, "My son, seek a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedon is too small for you." Looking back, that statement ended up being pretty accurate. By the time Alexander was 16, he was already governing parts of the kingdom while his father was away on military campaigns. By 18, he was fighting in major battles. By 20, everything changed. In 336 BC, King Philip II was assassinated. One moment Alexander was a prince, the next he was king. And almost immediately, people began questioning whether this young ruler could hold the kingdom together. Several Greek cities rebelled. Neighboring tribes sensed weakness. Enemies began preparing for war. Alexander responded the way he often would throughout his life, with overwhelming force. He marched south into Greece, crushed the rebellions, and made it very clear that he was not a temporary king. Then he turned his attention toward the greatest prize in the world, the Persian Empire. At the time, Persia was the superpower of the ancient world. It controlled enormous territories across Asia and possessed incredible wealth and manpower. Most rulers would have been happy simply defending their kingdom. Alexander wanted to conquer the entire thing. In 334 BC, at just 22 years old, he crossed into Asia with around 40,000 troops. Standing in his way was the largest empire on Earth. The odds weren't exactly in his favor. His first major victory came at the Battle of the Granicus River. Then came another victory, and another, and another. A pattern was beginning to emerge. Alexander simply didn't lose. The Persian king Darius III finally gathered a massive army to stop him. The two forces met at the Battle of Issus. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander launched a direct attack toward Darius himself. The strategy worked. Darius fled the battlefield. His army collapsed. Imagine being the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth and getting chased off the battlefield by a 20-something king from a country many Persians barely respected. Not exactly a great day at the office. After Issus, Alexander continued south. Many cities surrendered immediately. Others resisted and paid the price. One of the most famous examples was the city of Tyre. Tyre sat on an island and believed it was impossible to conquer. Alexander took that personally. Instead of giving up, he ordered his army to build a massive causeway through the sea directly to the city. It took months, But eventually, the city fell. The lesson was simple: no obstacle was too difficult if Alexander wanted something badly enough. Next came Egypt. Unlike some regions he conquered, the Egyptians welcomed him. They viewed him as a liberator rather than an invader. Alexander was declared pharaoh and founded a city that would become one of the most famous in history: Alexandria. If naming cities after yourself sounds a little arrogant, don't worry. Alexander would do it many more times. Then came the battle that changed everything: the Battle of Gaugamela. This was Alexander versus Darius one final time. Darius commanded a huge army, war chariots, cavalry, massive numbers. On paper, Persia should have won. Instead, Alexander pulled off one of the greatest military victories in history. Darius fled again. This time, the Persian Empire never recovered. At just 25 years old, Alexander had effectively conquered the most powerful empire on earth. Most people would retire after accomplishing something like that. Alexander decided to keep going. He pushed deeper into Asia, through deserts, across mountains, into territories few Greeks had ever seen. Every victory expanded his empire even further. By this point, Alexander wasn't just a king, he was becoming a legend. But perhaps his most difficult campaign awaited him in India. There he faced fierce resistance and something his army had never encountered before on such a scale: war elephants. Imagine being a soldier and seeing hundreds of giant armored elephants charging toward your position. That is probably not how anyone wants to spend their afternoon. Alexander still managed to win, but his troops had reached their limit. They had marched thousands of miles over many years. They wanted to go home. For the first time in his career, Alexander could not convince his men to continue. Reluctantly, he agreed to turn back. The conquest of the world would remain unfinished. Alexander returned west and began planning his next campaigns. Despite everything he had achieved, he was only 32 years old. Then, suddenly, everything came to an end. In 323 BC, while in Babylon, Alexander became seriously ill. Within days, he was dead. And to this day, historians still debate exactly what happened. Some believe he died from disease, others suspect complications from old battle wounds. A few theories even suggest poisoning. No one knows for certain. What makes the story even more fascinating is what happened after his death. Alexander left behind one of the largest empires in history, but he left no clear successor. Almost immediately, his generals began fighting each other for control. The empire fractured. Within a few decades, the empire Alexander built was divided into competing kingdoms. In a strange way, the one thing Alexander couldn't conquer was time itself. Yet even though his empire disappeared, his influence never did. Greek culture spread across 3 continents, trade routes expanded, cities flourished, entire civilizations were transformed. More than 2,000 years later, Alexander remains one of the most studied military leaders in history. Not because he ruled for decades, not because he lived a long life, but because before most people today finish college, Alexander had already conquered half the known world. And somehow, that still sounds almost impossible.